Thank you for being here today. We know it's the end of the symposium, which isn't always ideal, and so we appreciate your time. Today we're here to talk about enhancing equity considerations and transportation project funding using socioeconomic geospatial analysis. That's a lot of words, so we'll get into what that actually means in reality and in terms of implementation as we go. Slide. So my name is Joy Davis. I'm with the Institute for Transportation Research and Education. And today I'm presenting with Chase Nicholas, who is also with the Institute for Transportation Research and Education here at NC State. He is our GIS wizard, as I like to fondly refer to him. And then also we are working in partnership on this project with Jason Coupe, who is formerly with NC State's public administration and is now with Georgia State University. In terms of what we're going to talk about today, I want to just briefly touch on equity and transportation and what that looks like, how the two are related. We live and breathe that every day, and we know that not all of you do. So, and then talk about what planning prioritization specifically in North Carolina related to transportation looks like, since that's sort of the basis for our work here. Talk about the data available related to that. And then discuss raster suitability analysis, which is a method that we originally wanted to incorporate, and talk a little bit about what our method refinement looked like as we started to dig into the actual research, some of the decision points, challenges, and considerations, and then talk about what we're going to do going forward with the project. So in terms of equity and transportation, why is it important? So Lewis et al. Talk about how equity is inherently concerned with justice. And because it's related to the just distribution of resources in communities, and transportation services and projects essentially are distributed across communities as a resource, it's inherently tied into them. So many people rely on transportation to get access to their basic needs and opportunities for and connecting to things like education and jobs that help them advance in their lives. And so one of the key pieces related to transportation where equity can really come into play is transportation planning. So that's closely tied to land use planning, since often, the places where you live or get your health services or a business you connect to, you typically need transportation to get there. And so transportation planning uses population to forecast population, other data to essentially try to forecast where transportation infrastructure needs to be based on the needs. And so this, because of the nature of transportation, this ties into every single piece of the planning. The American Planning Association, really love this quote from them. They say, planning for equity means applying an equity lens for just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential into everything that planners do. So from the way that they work with community members, so the community engagement coming into play, to creating a shared vision for their neighborhood, to advocating for policies that connect people to opportunities at the local, state, and federal level. Planning equity is planning for all. Slide. And so in terms of our own backyard, I think this example related to the Durham Freeway helps illustrate why transportation planning and equity are just so incredibly tied together. So transportation, where we put it, can either result in benefits or burdens to communities. So in the case of the Durham Freeway example, so you can see here in 1950, this was a historically Black community that we're looking at here, and then a giant freeway was put through that community and essentially obliterated a lot of what was there, displaced people, businesses closed, people had to move. And so that's an example of how a transportation project, even though it was meant to provide a benefit, actually ended up burdening a community. And so looking at those impacts before a project's put in place and determining really what that means for equity in the surrounding communities is important. And so that's where that's where agencies like North Carolina Department of Transportation, they tend to prioritize how they invest their projects. So they can't fund all the projects in the world. They have to decide what they actually have money to invest in. And that's where equity can really come into play, because if we're looking at those impacts up front, that can determine how communities for generations to come are impacted by those projects. And so in the case of North Carolina specifically, I mentioned that transportation funding is allocated through a prioritization process that's dictated in North Carolina by a 2013 law. And the way that prioritization looks, it's a giant formula with many spreadsheets that essentially take all the proposed projects from across the state and compare them using a scoring system. And so that includes projects from all modes of transportation, so bicycle, pedestrian, highway, ferry, you name it. And then the scores are compared within and between those middle groups to determine what projects will be funded. And this is just, this table here just shows a very small snapshot of many, 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 many data points that are in the system for a given project and what that might look like. And so the program that is related to prioritization is called the Strategic Transportation Investment Program. And so this is an idea of just what that project distribution might look like in terms of that pool of proposed projects. So this is a snapshot from recent year of projects looking at what could have potentially been funded, related to pedestrian bicycle projects as well as transit projects in the Raleigh-Durham area. And so we talked earlier about how transportation planning and prioritization are so essential to equity, how the decisions that are made now can essentially provide ripple effects for years to come for communities, good or bad. And so in terms of where equity currently fits into the current prioritization program, there's some adjacent equity measures that are included, but they're, in terms of stronger measures, they haven't really been included in the process because they've been historically challenging to integrate. If any of you work with data, particularly data related to humans, that data can be messy and not always accurate. And so our goal through this project is to incorporate geolocated what we call socioeconomic data sets. So data related to health, socioeconomic states into the process in a way that's really easy to apply. And so we're trying to establish indices that ultimately help assess who and how a project may impact a community, and to augment that scoring process for everything but those highway projects. So pedestrian transit projects, for example, to ultimately provide NCDOT with a way to look at equity as part of their project decision-making process. And this is just an example of some of the data that we've looked at potentially incorporating. We won't be able to incorporate all, but because there's a lot of it out there, but just for example, saying how does somebody's age maybe relate to how a project could benefit them or hurt them potentially. And also, safety factors, so looking at potential crash rates in areas, education facilities, businesses. So there's a variety of different data sets we might be able to include, but again, as we'll discuss, there's no way to include all of it. So we're going to have to make some hard decisions on what is realistic. And so with that, I'll pass the ball to Chase.
Thanks, Joy. As Joy mentioned, our methodology is really about using geospatial techniques to help NCDOT incorporate a measure of equity impacts into their prioritization process. And I like to frame this just from the get-go in terms of methodological challenges. So what are the challenges that we need this geospatial method to rise to in order to be useful for NCDOT? So first and foremost, we need to develop a consistent quantitative technique that reflects real-world impacts. So we really want to align that project with its actual impact and make sure we're measuring the right thing. We also want to measure equity impacts at an appropriate geographic scale. So we want to get a good level of detail, and often that's difficult with the kind of granularity of the socioeconomic data that we have. Third, we want to ensure that our technique is suitable for statewide application. This is really important for NCDOT. We have a big, diverse state that includes a lot of rural areas, a lot of urban areas, and everything in between. And we want to make sure that we can provide a method that is going to be adequate for any location where a project is cited. And then finally, oh, if you can go back for me. Finally, we want to keep our method comprehensible and transparent. So we want this method to be easily understood when it's done. And we've gone through an iterative sort of process with our method development, as shown on the graphic on the right. We know that there are a lot of branching paths we can take, and we're exploring many of them. And I just want to kind of take you through our method development process, because I think it's been really helpful for us in learning what's worked well and what hasn't worked so well, and what we're trying to revise, and what we're trying to capture a little bit better as we work through coming up with a good, useful tool for NCDOT. So we'll start with a summary of our initial process, which was raster suitability analysis. Then move into what we've learned from communities of concern, which is a definition metropolitan planning organizations use in their transportation planning and prioritization efforts. And then discuss some novel techniques that we're developing, hopefully to deliver to NCDOT. Slide. As I mentioned, our initial approach was using raster suitability analysis. And the benefit of using this approach is that it's widely used for site selection in a variety of fields, not only in transportation planning, but often in environmental fields as well. And it's also used for expansion and point of entry criteria. If you're not familiar with what raster data is, it's basically just a spatial data format that stores information in the uniform grid of cells, where each cell contains a single value for some information, such as distance to a road. So if this little raster on the right was containing information about distance to roads, that cell in the top left corner would be, say, 50 feet, and the next one would be 45 feet, and then 40 feet, etc. And you can use any sort of spatial information in a raster format, not just that type of distance information. Some past examples where raster suitability analysis has been used in planning efforts and in other sciences too, I guess, are for waterfront park placement in Buffalo, for wildfire treatment and relief, and for wildflower placement on highways. And then a few that are specific to transit and transportation with socioeconomic criteria are for transit connectivity in Delaware, for metro transit mapping in the Gaza Strip, and for siting bus rapid transit stops in Ho Chi Minh City. So lots of applications all around the world, and definitely common in transportation planning. Slide. The basic premise behind raster suitability analysis is that we often want to simplify how we look at a stack of different geographic variables. We may have 3 geographic variables, such as are shown in this image here, that we want to simplify into a single layer. So we're kind of coming up with a composite measure from these individual inputs. And in this process, we're layering those individual layers to create a final suitability layer, a single value that reflects multiple variables. And we can also apply weighting to any of these individual layers. The map on the right just shows you what it might look like in a sort of 2-dimensional form for this final suitability layer that covers sort of part of an urban area there, where low suitability might correspond to dark green, and higher might correspond to the red. There are several steps and questions that need to be answered at each of those steps when conducting raster suitability analysis. The first is just to select which input data sets you're going to use. So what data is really important for answering this question that we have? Second, we need to pre-process the data often to get it into a spatial format that can be used in this sort of geospatial analysis. Third, we need to scale the data to get it into a uniform scale that can be used in suitability analysis. Often means defining high, medium, and low suitability categories and binning our data into those categories. We also need to decide on some weights that we're giving to those initial input data sets. So of the data we're choosing to answer this question with, which one answers most of the question and which one answers a little bit of the question. So we have to decide on those weights as well. And finally, given our suitability surface, we need to actually find a way to measure the impacts of projects. So how do our projects relate spatially to the data that's underneath them? So what our team did was develop a suitability model prototype. This is a small scale model we conducted just for Wake County. And we chose a few representative data sets and created a raster suitability surface from those data sets so that we have a better understanding about how this socioeconomic data is going to interact in a suitability model type application. And the data we used in this analysis was from the US Census ACS at the block group level. And we also used distance to transit stops. That ACS data, though, specifically was family poverty rates, racial ethnic minority status, disability status, households without access to a vehicle, and senior and elderly status. And the map on the right gives a sample of our final suitability layer. And we have values throughout the county ranging from 2 to 30. And these values are for every cell in that raster grid. Slide. To take this prototype all the way to its conclusion, we also developed a simple way to measure the impact of projects. And I call this simple because we're just using a project buffer here. So we're looking at what's within the vicinity of a project. That can be a quarter mile or a half mile. And from that vicinity, we're taking the average of all the cell values within the vicinity. And that gives us a single measure of suitability or of project impact, if you will, for each of our project geographies, that 15.1, 17.2, 10.5. Those values are representing the average values in that suitability layer within the vicinity of our projects. So like I said, we took this project to this conclusion point, measuring project suitability. And then we decided to take a step back and look at what we've learned and kind of take stock of what we did and didn't like so much about this process. Slide. So first, the issues we encountered. So our focus here is on equity, but we also noticed that in simplifying data, we were kind of over-compressing those human elements into a single score. We had a single metric, and that reduced a lot of the nuances that we had in the various data sets that we used to build the suitability layer. We also noticed that in the scaling that we had to conduct for creating our suitability surface, that data outliers were playing an outsized role in the measurement process. And finally, we really felt that this technique just added a lot of complexity and a lot of assumptions without a commensurate value to the outcome. So we ended up, like I said, with a really simple measure, sort of an average value within our buffers, but there was probably too much complexity and a little bit of opaque method really that went into arriving at those scores. So from there, we started exploring new approaches. So how can we improve upon what we've got from our kind of phase one? And in our process of exploring new approaches, we've been learning from prioritization techniques of metropolitan planning organizations, or MPOs, which I mentioned earlier, and we'll show a little bit more about in the next slide. We're also working on measuring variables individually instead of compressing them into that single score. And then finally, we're streamlining our method to involve less data processing and just kind of open it up, let the data speak for itself, make it simpler and more transparent. So in terms of method refinement, instead of standardizing, we are starting to compare variables to the regional mean. This is a lesson we really picked up from looking at these MPOs and how they define communities of concern. Communities of concern are essentially locations of demographic concentrations in regional planning areas of MPOs. And these are communities to which MPOs want to pay special attention when they're making prioritization and infrastructure project planning decisions. Just as Joy showed her slide about how highway development impacts a neighborhood in Durham, these are the type of neighborhoods we want to think about because they're likely to experience disproportionate impacts from transportation infrastructure projects. Often MPOs are looking at the same types of variables that we're interested in, which is income, racial and ethnic minority status, low English proficiency households, households without vehicles, etc. And in making these definitions, they're actually kind of making a binary designation. So some areas are communities of concern and some areas aren't. So we want to stay away in our work from a binary designation so that we could actually score a certain magnitude for a project. But we did really like the process of comparing what's going on in these areas to a regional mean. So on the next slide, I'll show you how we're employing that in our project. So instead of defining communities of concern in our work, what we're gearing up to do now is compare what's going on in the project impact area to the region as a whole. So we want to take each one of the variables we're interested in, measure it within the project impact area, and then compare it to the region. We know that our regions are going to vary across the state. Again, we have a lot of diversity in our state. We have really high values of some indicators in some areas, really low ones in other areas. And we think using regional mean helps us with those outliers. So essentially what we're doing is taking a project impact area, dividing it by the regional average to come up with a ratio that's going to be useful in scoring projects. So finally, instead of compressing variables into a single measure, which I think I mentioned, we're going to measure all variables this way. So many MPOs do the same thing when they're defining different subcategories of COCs. And this really allows us and allows MPOs as well to examine how these variables intersect and the relationship of these different variables. Instead of getting a single measure, we'll get a sort of matrix of measurements that allows each of those individual data layers to speak for itself. Slide. And on this slide, we just have basically another prototype of kind of our second iteration of our work, where we're looking at Division 5 for NCDOT. So this includes Wake County, but also Durham County and also many more rural counties to the north. In the map on the top left, you see the family poverty rate in the division. And in the map on the right, we're zooming in specifically on kind of inner urban Wake County, looking in the Beltline area and seeing how some of these scores kind of work out. I've reported the project names as well as the ratios, specifically the family poverty rate ratios when looking at a project impact area versus the region as a whole. We think there are improvements to how we're doing our buffer process right now, but we have a simple buffer right now that we're using to kind of test out some of these ratio-based calculations. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Jason to kind of talk about some key decisions that we have left for the rest of our work.
Thanks, Chase and Joy. Given the sort of rundown of the kinds of decisions that, the kind of processes that we've been making so far, here are some sort of key decision points that we've been noting and still working through. So as Chase mentioned, we're still sort of working through scaling the final measurements, defining the project impact areas, particularly because there's so much diversity, not just within the Wake County planning area, but also statewide as we sort of move towards building these models out, broadening our applications, area weighting processes, as well as the different approaches to scoring based on the different spatial characteristics of the projects, right? So we, if a path runs through a set of neighborhoods, for instance, there are different ways that we can consider how to score the relationship that path has to those different neighborhoods. There's some methodological challenges and considerations as well that we're still sort of working through and thinking through building menus for. One is defining equity, right? Like that term is a sort of a catch-all for lots of different sort of human-centered, justice-oriented concepts that we're still parsing out. We also need to think through the ways that equity is different for both between urban and rural communities, how those concerns may trade off, and what a project in one space may mean for a project in the other, as well as the different data points that may matter to both sort of sets of communities. We also need to think through relative versus statewide measures. Again, so North Carolina is a diverse state, right? And so some measurements, some measures that we have may be better for regional concerns, but some measures that we have may be applicable statewide. And so thinking through both of those. The census data changes in 2020. The 2020 census went through a major privacy-related change that has implications for unit of analyses beyond the regional level, particularly given access to the data, the access level that our partners have, including NCDOT. We'll need to sort of think through what those changes may mean for implementation. And the sort of remaining, this list isn't exclusive, but the remaining piece that we should talk about is the role of gentrification in North Carolina communities. The state is changing rapidly. It's one of the fastest growing states. The urban areas are among the fastest growing in the country, which also means the suburban areas are growing very quickly and changing. And so thinking through what those changes mean and how we account for those changes and the communities that exist now is a challenge that we're going to work through in the future. And so just to sort of recap, so we're still refining the best ways to measure equity in the context of transportation. And this may mean moving away a little bit from our dependency on RSA, right? We may find that there are different ways to score and to measure equity that are more flexible and better fits for the kinds of projects that are being evaluated in North Carolina. There's a trade-off between simplicity and nuance. So sometimes simple measures are easier to think through, right? If we could have, for instance, one score that catches everything, maybe easier to understand and easier and simpler to implement. But sometimes those simpler approaches can miss meaningful nuance. And so we're sort of thinking through some of the trade-offs that we have as far as simplicity versus precision. Integrating new approaches into public systems is a delicate task. The prioritization process in North Carolina is complex, one of the more complex processes in the country. And while it means that the projects are scored in a nuanced way, it also means that we need to be really careful thinking through how we integrate our measurements into the existing processes. And one of the bigger sort of sticks that we'll need to think through is the notion that we can't capture everything, and there may be trade-offs with what we can implement and capture meaningfully versus what may be difficult to impossible to build into the existing structure. Sort of a last data point, sometimes public access to really good data is limited. This dovetails nicely with larger conversations in the open science community. But access for our partners may not have access to the same data that we do. That's true for both NCDOT and other partners that we will work with as this project and other projects like it evolve. And so there may be hurdles to integrating data into existing structures if access to that data is not uniformly easy. And so it presents a hurdle for implementation, but also should serve as a broader discussion point for the usefulness of broadening data accessibility moving forward. All right, so looking ahead to our next steps. So we first hope to gain feedback from you which we certainly are thankful for. Refining our new methods using project samples from different prioritization cycles from past iterations of scoring processes at NCDOT. We're going to integrate additional infrastructure data to supplement the equity variables that we're working through now. We'll finalize the variables at some point and ensure compatibility with the existing data infrastructure and scoring infrastructure at NCDOT. And we'll want to build a model with flexible enough parameters such that it can evolve with as needs evolve, as communities evolved, and as the prioritization process evolves as well. And most importantly, on our part, with regards to this project, is working closely with NCDOT to meaningfully implement. We've been working on this project because we're excited about what it could mean for how NCDOT can prioritize equity in the future and access to critical transportation infrastructure for the communities that need them should be reflected in our scoring processes. So thank you for listening and for engaging, and we'll pause now for questions and comments. I'm gonna stop the share. So feel free to chime in at any point. We're a pretty small community here. So all right. Well, all right, thank you. No questions there, Tally. All right, well, thank you for listening. And the recording of the presentation, I believe, is available. And so if there are any questions that pop up or thoughts or points of connection that appear as important going forward, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thanks again for listening and for stopping through. Bye, everyone.